"You dare slap me," I whispered, voice breaking. "At my own grandson's wedding? In front of everyone?" The sound cracked through the wedding hall like thunder. My cheek burned red hot. I pressed my trembling hand to my face, staring in disbelief at my grandson's bride, the young woman in white who had just raised her hand against me. The crowd gasped. Forks clinked down on plates, champagne glasses stilled midair. Conversations froze into silence. The band stopped playing mid-note. And there she stood, my grandson's new wife, eyes blazing with fury, lips curled in a sneer. Her chest heaved with rage, her perfectly applied makeup now smudged with anger. The delicate pearl necklace I had given her as a wedding gift glittered mockingly around her throat. "Yes," she spat, venom dripping from her tongue. "I slapped you, and I'd do it again. You had no right to invite your little friend here. This is my wedding, not yours." She jabbed her manicured finger toward my dear friend Margaret, who sat frozen in shock at table 7, the woman who had held my hand through my husband's funeral, who had driven me to chemotherapy appointments when my family was too busy. Gasps erupted across the hall. Someone muttered, "Did she just slap the grandmother?" Others covered their mouths in shock. A woman at the back table stood up, shaking her head in disgust. "That's disgraceful," she whispered loudly enough for others to hear. But the bride wasn't finished. Her voice rose higher, piercing through the stunned silence. "She ruins everything she touches. Always has to be the center of attention. Always has to make everything about her sob story and her dead husband." The cruelty in her words hit me like physical blows. My late husband, Robert, the man who had loved this grandson like his own, who had taught him to ride a bike, to throw a baseball, to be a gentleman. Before I could respond, another voice pierced my heart deeper than the slap itself. My daughter-in-law, my son's wife, the groom's mother, stepped forward, siding with the bride. Her face was flushed with what looked like relief, as if she'd been waiting for this moment. The navy blue dress I had helped her pick out seemed to mock me now. "She's right, Linda," she snapped, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "This day isn't about you. It's about my son and his bride. Stop making everything about yourself." She crossed her arms, her wedding ring catching the light, the same ring my son had bought with money I had secretly lent him years ago. "You've been nothing but a burden since Robert died. Always calling, always needing something, always interfering in our lives." The betrayal cut through me like a knife. Around us, guests began choosing sides. Some shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Others leaned forward, hungry for drama. A few elderly women at the corner table looked appalled, whispering among themselves. I turned slowly to look at my son, the groom's father, the boy I raised with sleepless nights and endless sacrifices. His face was pale, his eyes downcast. He loosened his tie nervously, the same nervous habit he'd had since childhood when he was caught between doing what was right and what was easy. And when he finally spoke, his words shattered me. "Please, Mother, don't ruin this day." Not, "I'm sorry she hit you." Not, "That was wrong." Just, "Don't ruin this day." As if I, the victim, was somehow the villain in this story. Imagine it. Your grandson's bride slaps you in public. Your son's wife, the mother of the groom, supports her. And your own son, the man you gave life to, looks at you like you are the problem. The young server who had been refilling water glasses stood frozen nearby, her tray trembling in her hands. Even she seemed to understand the magnitude of what had just happened. My heart clenched with humiliation, my vision blurred with tears. And yet, a fire began to stir inside me. Because what none of them knew was this. I had paid for this entire wedding. Every crystal chandelier above our heads, every white rose centerpiece, every note the string quartet had played during the ceremony. All of it funded by my carefully saved pension money and the life insurance Robert had left me. And before the night was over, they would regret the day they slapped me. As I stood there humiliated, my mind spun back through the years. I could see 5-year-old Tommy, my son, standing in our tiny kitchen in his 2 small pajamas, watching me count coins on the counter to buy his school lunch for the week. I raised my son with hands that bled from double shifts at the textile factory. The memory of those endless nights came flooding back, coming home at midnight, feet swollen in cheap shoes, only to find Tommy still awake, waiting for a bedtime story. When he was in college and couldn't afford books, I worked weekends cleaning the Henderson mansion on Oak Street. I scrubbed their toilets and mopped their marble floors so my boy could get his education. I remember the phone call when he was struggling in his sophomore year. "Mom, I need $300 for chemistry textbooks, or I'll have to drop out." $300 might as well have been $3,000 for a factory worker's widow. But I found it. I sold my mother's china set, the one she'd saved for special occasions that never came. When my grandson Danny was born, I stepped in like a second mother. Those first months when colic kept him screaming through the night, his parents would call me at 2 a.m. "Mom, can you come over? We haven't slept in days." And I would drive through snow and rain in my old Buick, still wearing my factory uniform, to hold that baby and sing the same lullabies I'd sung to his father. I held him through those endless nights when his parents were too tired. I saved from my meager pension to buy him his first school supplies. The dinosaur backpack he'd begged for, the light-up sneakers that made him feel special. I stood at every little league game, clapping louder than anyone else, my voice hoarse from cheering. While other parents sat in their folding chairs scrolling their phones, I was on my feet, shouting, "That's my grandson." With every hit, every run, every small triumph. When Danny made the honor roll in middle school, his parents were at work. I was the one who picked him up, took him to McDonald's, and told him how proud I was. I was the one who hung his report card on my refrigerator like it was a Nobel Prize. I thought I had raised a son who would honor me, a grandson who would never forget me. The irony wasn't lost on me now, standing in this grand ballroom, surrounded by strangers who seemed more outraged on my behalf than my own family. And when the wedding planning began 6 months ago, they bragged about throwing a grand celebration. "We want something elegant," the bride had announced during Sunday dinner at my little house. "Something people will remember forever." But I knew the truth. I'd seen my son's credit card bills when he left them on my counter. I'd heard the late-night phone arguments between him and his wife about money. They had nothing. They couldn't afford even half of it. So quietly, I stepped in. Not with fanfare, not demanding recognition, just love in action. I wrote the check for the hall, $20,000 for the Crystal Ballroom downtown, with its soaring ceilings and breathtaking chandeliers. I paid for the catering, $15,000 for prime rib and salmon, for the chocolate fountain the bride insisted on, for the open bar that was even now fueling the guests' whispered conversations. I covered the flowers, $5,000 for white roses and baby's breath, arranged in the elaborate displays that now seemed to mock my humiliation. Even the bride's gown, the very one she slapped me in, was purchased with my money, $3,500 for Italian silk and hand-sewn beadwork. Not because I wanted glory, but because I loved my grandson and wanted him to have his dream day. And now, here I was, humiliated by the very people who stood on the foundation of my sacrifice. Have you ever given everything to family only to be treated like nothing? Would you forgive them, or make them regret it? Tell me below. The slap was the climax, but the disrespect had been brewing all day. It started that morning when I arrived at the church 2 hours early, as I'd promised, to help with last-minute preparations. The bride's mother, a woman who drove a BMW and lived in the suburbs, looked me up and down with thinly veiled disdain. "Oh, you're here early," she said, as if I were some unwelcome vagrant who'd wandered in off the street. I was wearing my best dress, the navy blue one I'd bought for Robert's funeral and had worn to every special occasion since. It was modest, appropriate, and clean. But next to her designer outfit, I felt like a church mouse. At the rehearsal dinner the night before, they placed my seat at the farthest corner of the room, next to the kitchen doors where the servers rushed in and out with trays. Every time someone opened those doors, the smell of dishwater and industrial soap wafted over me. Other guests had to shout over the clanging of pots and pans when they tried to speak to me. Guests whispered, "Why isn't the grandmother up front with the family?" I heard Margaret, my dear friend, asking Danny's girlfriend's mother, "Shouldn't Mrs. Williams be at the head table with the rest of the family?" The response was a dismissive shrug. There wasn't room. There wasn't room. At a table for 12, where they'd seated the bride's college roommates and the groom's fraternity brothers, there wasn't room for the grandmother who'd helped raise him. I overheard the bride telling her bridesmaids, "She's old and embarrassing. Keep her out of the pictures." They were clustered near the ladies' room, touching up their lipstick when she said it. I'd gone to freshen up myself and heard every cruel word through the thin door. Seriously, girls, when the photographer starts doing family shots, just create a wall or something. I don't want her withered face in my wedding album. The bridesmaids giggled nervously. One of them, a sweet girl named Ashley, said quietly, "But isn't she paying for—" "I don't care what she's paying for," the bride cut her off. "This is about my special day, not some old lady's feelings." During the ceremony, my daughter-in-law proudly sat beside the bride's parents in the front row while I was shoved to the back behind people I'd never met. I watched my grandson, my boy Danny, who used to crawl into my lap to hear stories about his grandfather, exchange vows with this woman who'd just called me withered and embarrassing. The pastor, a kind man who'd known our family for years, kept glancing back at me with confusion. He'd expected to see me in the family section. The pastor introduced the proud parents during the ceremony, gesturing to the front rows, but never once mentioned the grandmother who helped raise the groom. No acknowledgement of the woman who'd attended every parent-teacher conference when his parents were working. No mention of the countless hours I'd spent teaching him to read, helping with homework, bandaging scraped knees. At the reception, the humiliations continued in waves. My daughter-in-law made sure my name was left off the thank you speech entirely. She stood at the microphone, radiant in her mother-of-the-groom dress, which I'd also helped pay for, and thanked everyone from the florist to the parking attendant. "We want to thank my parents for their emotional support," she gushed. "The bride's parents for welcoming Danny into their family. Our friends for traveling so far to be here. Even our wedding planner deserves recognition for making this day perfect." But not one word about the woman who'd made it financially possible. When I brought along my lifelong friend Margaret, who had supported me through widowhood, who'd been like a sister to me for 40 years, the bride's attitude shifted from dismissive to openly hostile. Margaret had dressed carefully in her best outfit, had brought a thoughtful gift, had been nothing but polite and kind to everyone she met. But when the bride saw her at our table, her eyes narrowed to slits. "Who invited her?" she hissed to my daughter-in-law, loud enough for nearby guests to hear. "This isn't her place. Get her out." Margaret's face crumpled. This woman who'd held my hand through my darkest days, who'd never asked for anything in return for decades of friendship, was being treated like garbage. And then, the slap. It wasn't just an insult. It was a declaration. You don't matter. You don't belong. You're nothing here. And what did my family do? My son's wife cheered the bride on, nodding vigorously as if she'd been waiting for someone to finally put me in my place. My son stayed silent, fidgeting with his cufflinks, looking anywhere but at his mother's burning cheek. And my grandson, the boy I raised, looked torn, but too scared of his new wife to defend me. Would you sit silently if your daughter-in-law slapped your own mother? Or would you stand up and defend her? Tell me in the comments. I walked away from the head table, my purse clutched tightly against my chest like armor. My face still stung from the slap, but more than that, my heart ached with a pain deeper than any physical wound. Behind me, I could hear the conversation slowly resuming, the awkward clink of silverware as guests tried to pretend they hadn't just witnessed a family implode. Some whispered sympathetically, "That poor woman. How could they treat their own mother like that? Someone should call the police. That was assault." But others seemed entertained by the drama. "Did you see her face when she got slapped?" Finally, someone put the old bat in her place. I found refuge in the ladies' lounge, a quiet alcove with mirrors surrounded by soft lighting. My reflection stared back at me, 73 years old, cheek red from the blow, eyes bright with unshed tears. But as I stared at myself, something shifted. My tears dried. My shoulders straightened. Inside my bag was a folder, neat, heavy, full of truth. I'd brought it thinking I might need to show someone if there were questions about payments or arrangements. I never imagined I'd need it as evidence of my own worth. Every receipt, every contract, every bill, signed by me in my careful handwriting. $20,000 for the hall, the contract bearing my signature, my bank account number. $15,000 for catering, itemized down to the last dinner roll and glass of wine. $5,000 for flowers, including the boutonniere pinned to my son's lapel and the corsage on my daughter-in-law's wrist. $3,500 for the dress, the receipt showing I'd paid in full for the gown that now seemed to mock me with its pristine whiteness. Every check written by my trembling but determined hand. They thought I was just the forgotten old lady in the corner, but every forkful of prime rib they were eating, every sip of champagne they were drinking, every note of music filling the air, it all came from my sacrifice. I remembered my husband Robert's words from years ago, spoken during another family conflict. "Linda, never let anyone strip your dignity. Even family must learn respect. Sometimes, especially family." He'd been talking about his own brother then, who'd tried to cheat us out of our share of their mother's estate. Robert had stood firm, had demanded what was right, had taught me that love without respect was just enabling cruelty. The fire inside me turned from hurt to steel-cold determination. It was time. I straightened my dress, checked my appearance one final time, and walked back into the reception hall with purpose. The bride was holding court at the head table, regaling her bridesmaids with some story that had them laughing uproariously. My daughter-in-law sat beside her, nodding along like an eager apprentice. My son was nursing what looked like his fourth whiskey, avoiding eye contact with everyone. My grandson was dancing with one of the bridesmaids, seemingly trying to forget what had just happened. I found the wedding planner near the kitchen, a thin young man named Marcus, who'd been nothing but professional throughout the planning process. He froze when he saw my expression. Marcus had coordinated enough weddings to recognize the look of someone who'd reached their breaking point. "Mrs. Williams," he said carefully, "is there anything I can help you with?" "You know whose name is on your contracts, don't you?" I asked, my voice calm but sharp as a blade. He nodded quickly, glancing nervously toward the head table. "Yes, ma'am. Every single one. You've been wonderful to work with." "Good," I said, my resolve hardening with each word. "Then when I ask for the microphone, you hand it to me. No questions, no hesitation." Marcus swallowed hard. He was young, maybe 25, probably didn't make enough money to risk losing clients over family drama, but he'd seen enough of human nature to recognize justice when it stood in front of him. "Of course, Mrs. Williams," he said quietly. It's your event, after all." And so, after the best man finished his rambling, alcohol-fueled speech about college adventures and scoring with the ladies, the music dimmed. The DJ cleared his throat. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have one more speaker tonight. A few words from the grandmother of the groom, Mrs. Linda Williams." The announcement hit the room like a thunderclap. all eyes turned to me as I rose from my banished corner table. The bride's face went white, then red, then white again. She started to stand, to object, but my daughter-in-law grabbed her arm and pulled her back down. My daughter-in-law's eyes were wide with panic. She knew what was coming. They all did. My son looked like he might be sick. My grandson stopped mid-dance and stared at me with something between hope and terror. I walked to the center of the room, folder in hand, my heels clicking against the marble floor with the rhythm of a funeral march. The crowd was dead silent now. Even the servers stopped moving. My cheek still burned from the slap, but my voice was steady as granite when I began to speak. "Tonight," I said, letting my words carry to every corner of the room. I was humiliated, slapped, told I was nothing, that I didn't belong at my own grandson's wedding. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Some guests leaned forward in their seats. Others pulled out their phones. I was called embarrassing. My dear friend was told she didn't belong here. I was shoved into corners, left out of speeches, treated like some unwelcome stranger who'd wandered in off the street. The bride was shaking now, her perfect composure cracking like a mask. My daughter-in-law looked around desperately, as if searching for an escape route. "But let me ask you this." I held the folder high above my head, the receipts and contracts visible through the clear plastic sleeve. "Who do you think paid for this wedding?" The silence was deafening. You could have heard a pin drop in that ballroom. The bride's smirk, which had been wavering, finally collapsed entirely. My daughter-in-law stiffened in her chair like she'd been turned to stone. "The hall you're sitting in, $20,000. The food you've been eating, $15,000. The flowers decorating every table, $5,000. The music you've been dancing to, the drinks you've been sipping, even the gown she slapped me in. All paid for by me." I opened the folder with deliberate ceremony, pulling out receipt after receipt, contract after contract. Every last detail planned and paid for by the old, embarrassing woman you thought you could humiliate and dismiss. The hall erupted, not in whispers this time, but in audible gasps, exclamations, and even some scattered applause. "Unbelievable!" someone called out. "Shame on them!" shouted an elderly man from the back. "That's disgusting behavior!" added a woman near the front. I turned to face my grandson directly, locking eyes with the young man who used to run to my arms whenever he scraped his knee or had a bad dream. "Danny," I said, my voice softer now but no less firm. "I did all of this for you, out of love, because I wanted your special day to be perfect. And yet your bride slapped me in front of everyone. Your mother supported her cruelty, and your father told me not to ruin your day, as if I was the one who'd done something wrong." Danny's face was a mask of shame and confusion. His new wife was crying now, mascara running down her cheeks in black streaks. The bride tried one last desperate move. She stood up, wobbling slightly in her expensive heels, and pointed an accusatory finger at me. She's lying," she stammered. "She's just a bitter old woman who can't stand that this day isn't about her." But I was ready for this. I slammed the receipts down on the nearest table with a sound like a gavel striking. The proof was irrefutable. Bank statements, canceled checks, signed contracts, all bearing my name, my signature, my financial sacrifice. The guests nearest the table picked up the papers, examining them, passing them around. Murmurs of amazement and disgust rippled through the crowd. "It's all true," someone whispered loudly enough for everyone to hear. The bride's legs gave out, and she collapsed back into her chair. My daughter-in-law tried to object again, but her voice cracked and came out as nothing more than a pathetic squeak. My son buried his face in his hands, finally understanding the magnitude of what his family had done. The guests were choosing sides now, and it wasn't even close. A group of women at table 3 stood up and began clapping. Others joined them. Soon, half the room was on their feet, applauding not just for me but for justice itself. But some people, mostly the bride's family and friends, booed and hissed. Her mother stood up and screamed, "This is outrageous! You're ruining their special day." "No," I replied, my voice cutting through the chaos like a sword. "I'm revealing the truth about who paid for their special day, and how they chose to repay that generosity." The scene that followed was chaos and vindication rolled into one. The bride fled first, stumbling toward the exit in her expensive heels, her white gown dragging behind her like the train of a defeated queen. Her bridesmaids scurried after her, leaving their purses and half-finished dinners behind. My daughter-in-law stood up next, her face red with humiliation and rage. She pointed a shaking finger at me and screamed, "You vindictive old witch! You planned this. You set us up." But her accusations fell flat against the wall of evidence I'd presented. The guests weren't buying her desperate attempts to shift blame. "You set yourself up," called out Margaret's sister Rose from table 6. "Nobody made you treat your mother-in-law like garbage." My daughter-in-law looked around the room, searching for allies, but found only disapproving faces and shaking heads. Finally, she grabbed her purse and fled toward the exit, hurrying after the bride like a loyal servant following her queen into exile. But my son stayed. He sat at the head table, his head in his hands, his shoulders shaking. When he finally looked up, his eyes were red with tears. "Mom," he whispered, but his voice carried in the sudden quiet that had fallen over the room. "Mom, I'm so sorry." The words hung in the air like a prayer. And then, the moment that made everything worthwhile, my grandson walked toward me. Danny approached slowly, his face a map of conflicting emotions. The young man who'd been too afraid to defend me earlier was finally finding his courage. With tears streaming down his face, he wrapped me in a hug that reminded me of all the times he'd run to me as a scared little boy. "Grandma," he whispered into my shoulder, his voice breaking. "I'm so sorry. I was a coward. I should have stood up for you. I should have stopped her." I held him tight, feeling the weight of years of love and sacrifice, of disappointment and vindication, all wrapped up in that one embrace. "You're here now," I whispered back. "That's what matters." When we broke apart, Danny turned to face the remaining guests. His voice was stronger now, filled with the conviction he should have had hours ago. "My grandmother is right," he announced. "She paid for this entire wedding, every detail, every expense, and we treated her terribly. I'm ashamed of myself, and I'm ashamed of my wife." The crowd murmured its approval. Someone started clapping again, and soon the applause was thunderous. I raised my hand for silence, then lifted the champagne glass that had been sitting untouched at my banished table. "I came here tonight to celebrate love," I said, my voice carrying to every corner of the ballroom. "Real love, the kind that sacrifices, the kind that endures, the kind that doesn't demand recognition but deserves respect." I looked around the room at the faces watching me, some guilty, some supportive, all transfixed by the drama they'd witnessed. "I want to make a toast," I continued, "to true family. Not the people who share your blood and then treat you like dirt. Not the ones who take your generosity and repay it with cruelty, but the ones who stand by you, who defend you, who honor the love you've given them." I gestured toward Margaret, my dear friend who had been insulted and dismissed, but had stayed by my side through it all. I looked at Danny, who had finally found his backbone and chosen to do what was right. I even nodded toward the handful of guests, some strangers, some distant relatives, who had stood up and applauded when the truth was revealed. "To true family," I said, raising my glass higher. The response was overwhelming. Glasses clinked throughout the room as people stood and echoed my toast, "To true family." Far as the toast concluded and conversations began to resume, I knew my work here was done. I walked toward the exit with my head held high, my dignity restored, my point made crystal clear. Behind me, I could hear fragments of conversation. Can you believe how they treated her? That poor woman, paying for everything and getting slapped for her trouble. I hope that bride learned her lesson. If I ever treated my mother-in-law like that, my husband would divorce me on the spot. The valet brought my car around, my old Buick that had faithfully carried me to countless family events, many of them celebrations I'd helped fund but received little credit for. As I drove away from the crystal ballroom, I caught a glimpse of the bride and my daughter-in-law in the rearview mirror. They were standing on the sidewalk, the bride still in her wedding dress, both of them looking lost and defeated. Part of me felt sorry for them, but a larger part, the part that had been disrespected, slapped, and humiliated, felt only the satisfaction of justice served. The next morning, my phone rang early. It was Danny. "Grandma?" His voice was small, uncertain. "Can I come over? I need to talk to you." An hour later, he was sitting at my kitchen table, the same table where I'd helped him with homework, where we'd shared countless cookies and glasses of milk, where I'd listened to his dreams and fears throughout his childhood. "She left," he said without preamble. "What do you mean, left?" "Ashley, my wife. She packed her bags this morning and went to her parents' house. She said she can't be married to someone whose family would humiliate her like that." I set down my coffee cup carefully. "And how do you feel about that?" Danny was quiet for a long moment, staring at his hands. "Relieved," he admitted finally. "Is that terrible? I should be devastated, right? But I just feel relieved." I reached across the table and took his hand in mine, the same hand I'd held when he was afraid of the dark, when he'd fallen off his bike, when he'd been heartbroken over his first crush. "Sometimes," I said gently, "we don't realize how heavy a burden is until we set it down." He squeezed my hand tighter. "I'm sorry, Grandma, for not standing up for you, for letting her treat you that way, for choosing the easy path instead of the right one. We all make mistakes, sweetheart. The question is what we learn from them." Danny nodded, tears starting to fall again. "I learned that real love isn't about keeping the peace," he said. "It's about protecting the people who matter. And you've always mattered to me, Grandma. I forgot that for a while." As I sit here now, weeks later, reflecting on that night, I think about the lessons learned. My daughter-in-law eventually called to apologize, though her words rang hollow and self-serving. She was more concerned about what people might think than about the hurt she'd caused. My son has been trying to make amends, bringing flowers, offering to help with household repairs, struggling to rebuild what his silence had broken. But it's Danny's transformation that gives me the most hope. He's filed for annulment, citing irreconcilable differences and what his lawyer called fundamental character incompatibility. More importantly, he's begun to understand the difference between love that demands respect and love that accepts abuse. "I want to find someone like you, Grandma," he told me last week. "Someone who knows how to love people without losing themselves. Someone who stands up for what's right, even when it's hard." The money I spent on that wedding wasn't wasted after all. It bought something more valuable than a party. It revealed everyone's true character, including my own. They thought they buried me in humiliation that night. They thought the slap would silence me, that their cruelty would send me shrinking into the shadows. But they forgot something important. I was the seed. And seeds always rise. They thought I was weak because I was generous. They mistook kindness for doormat behavior. They confused love with permission to abuse. But on that night, in that ballroom, surrounded by the very luxury my sacrifice had provided, I showed them the difference between a woman who gives from love and a woman who's learned to demand respect. The wedding they thought would celebrate their power over me became the night they learned that every generosity has its limits, every kindness has its boundaries, and every love, even a grandmother's love, comes with the expectation of basic human dignity. Some people have asked me if I regret what I did that night, if I wish I'd handled it differently, more quietly, more appropriately. My answer is always the same. I regret that it was necessary. I regret that people I loved thought so little of me that they believed they could slap me without consequences. I regret that it took such a dramatic moment to teach them that respect isn't optional in a relationship, it's required. But I don't regret standing up for myself. I don't regret revealing the truth. And I certainly don't regret showing that room full of people what happens when you mistake someone's generosity for weakness. The bride thought she was marrying into a family where she could treat the grandmother like hired help. My daughter-in-law thought she'd finally found an ally in her years-long campaign to sideline me. My son thought his silence would buy him peace. They all learned that night that love without respect is just exploitation wearing a prettier name. And me? I learned that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to accept unacceptable behavior, even from family, especially from family. Because the people who truly love you will rise to meet your standards. And the ones who don't, well, they'll show you exactly who they are when you stop accepting less than you deserve. That night, in that ballroom, I stopped being the family doormat and became the family foundation instead. Solid, unshakable, and worthy of the respect I'd always deserved but finally demanded. They thought the slap would end the conversation. Instead, it started a revolution. Thank you for reading. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so you never miss another story. And tomorrow, join me for the story of how my family said I was so useless, and then I saved my granddaughter when nobody else could. Because sometimes the people who underestimate you are the very ones who need you most.